Hello everybody, my name is Eric, and recently I've been enjoying the game Little Hope by Supermassive Games. The game focuses on the fictional town of the same name, a town whose history includes gruesome witch trials. While most of us are familiar, at least passingly, with the Salem witch trials, the game seems to take more inspiration from the lesser-known trials that took place in the neighboring town of Andover. Quick disclaimer. Since this is intended to be a short and hopefully entertaining video and not a full history or theology class, some topics may be condensed out of necessity. Also, some information, particularly that in the late Middle Ages, contains conflicting evidence, leading to a lack of consensus among historians. In these cases, I went with the information that had the most consensus, fit the story the best, or that I just liked better. People can and do spend a lifetime studying this stuff. If you'd like to learn more, I will leave some links in the description. Now, on to the good stuff. Contrary to popular belief, the hysteria surrounding witches is a relatively modern occurrence. By modern, of course, I mean 15th century or so. Many point to the Holy Inquisitions that began in the 12th century as witch hunts, but the purpose of these inquests was to root out what the Church saw as heresy. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church claimed all Christians under their umbrella and made it a priority to maintain a consistent doctrine. The Inquisitions, then, were an attempt to stamp out deviant teachings or heterodoxy among splinter sects. Prior to the formation of the Inquisitions, it was the purview of local churches to deal with heretics as they saw fit. However, the rise of splinter groups such as Cathars, Spiritual Franciscans, Hussites, and the Beguines caused a more formal response to heterodoxy from the papal seat. Initially, unless one was deemed an unrepentant heretic, punishments for heresy were rather light, such as wearing a cross sewn into one's clothing or going on a pilgrimage. But by the mid to late 1400s, these tactics had become downright brutal. A translation of an inquisitorial manual reads, "For punishment does not take place primarily and per se for the correction and good of the person punished, but for the public good, in order that others may become terrified and weaned away from the evils they would commit." In other words, they wanted to scare people into correct belief. The famous Spanish Inquisition was created independently of the Church and was born of the harsh anti-Semitism present in the Iberian Peninsula at the end of the 15th century. According to the law at the time, forced baptism was not a valid sacrament. Those Jews and Moors who had been converted in this way could legally return to their old religions. The law, however, took an incredibly narrow view of the term forced, meaning that someone would have had to physically baptize another who actively resisted. Coercion under duress was apparently perfectly acceptable. And after the pogroms of the century before, many Jews faced death, or worse, if they didn't convert, putting them under the direct authority of the Spanish Inquisition, who rooted out any remaining vestiges of their old religions by any means they deemed appropriate. By contrast, witchcraft, at least in an official capacity, was looked at with much more leniency. In fact, official Christian doctrine denied the very existence of witches and witchcraft, condemning it as pagan superstition during the medieval era. The Canon Episcopi, a traditional passage in medieval canon law at least as old as 906 AD, stated that while the devil and demons were very real, their powers were limited to one's mind and could in no way affect the physical world. An accusation of witchcraft could get you expelled from one's home, but would most likely earn you a night in the stockade. Philosopher/doctor/saint Thomas Aquinas may have been the catalyst that changed this view. Aquinas was an adherent of Aristotle, who lived in the late 1200s and wrote much on natural law, metaphysics, and political theory. On the topic of magic and witchcraft, he wrote that only God can perform miracles, create, and transform. Angels and demons, what he called spiritual substances, may do wonderful things, but they are not miracles and merely use natural things as instruments. Any efficacy of magicians does not come from power of particular words or celestial bodies or special figures or sympathetic magic, but by bidding. He said that demons are intellective substances who were created good and have chosen to be bad, and that it is these who are bid. If there is some transformation that could not occur in nature, it is either the demon working on human imagination or arranging a falsehood. In other words, magic, then, is the work of demons done at the behest of humans. a very logical and Aristotelian point of view. Fast forward, however, 2 centuries to 1484. Heinrich Kramer, assistant to the Archbishop of Salzburg, leads an investigation into witchcraft into Innsbruck, Austria. 14 people are accused, including Helena Schuberin, a wealthy and strong-minded woman. During the trial, several witnesses gave testimony that Kramer harbored extreme prejudice and animosity towards Helena and 6 other women on trial. Some suggest that he is obsessed with Helena, who publicly called him evil during a sermon, and that he may have had a sexual fixation on her. In the end, Helena was acquitted, and the other women received mild penance, since at that time sorcery was still seen as a very minor offense. Not satisfied with the outcome of the trial, Kramer persisted, and is eventually kicked out of Innsbruck by the bishop, who calls him both insane and senile. In the ultimate shitpost retaliation, Kramer wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, often referred to as the Hammer of Witches, a manual for hunting down the servants of Satan, going so far as to forge official writs and endorsements by top theologians to claim sanction. Ironically, it was secular courts, not the Inquisition, that ended up using the book. The Malleus Maleficarum contradicted official church doctrine on several subjects and was immediately censured by Kramer's superiors, its author portrayed as a lunatic. In the book, which quotes Thomas Aquinas' work more than 100 times, Kramer argued that witchcraft should be tantamount to heresy and treated as such, complete with the harsher punishments. The Inquisition gave it no authority, however, but despite heavy opposition from other inquisitors, Kramer continued to preach and gain responsibility in the church until his death in 1505. It wasn't until the Protestant Reformation, some 2 decades or so later, and the Catholic revival that followed, when the Malleus Maleficarum really saw its heyday, the more Puritan separatists focusing on salvation theology and the fear of a wrathful God. The bulk of witch trials in Europe took place in Germany and the British Isles between 1650 and 1750. Estimates of the number of people executed have ranged as high as 9 million. However, the more scholarly estimate is somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000, still no small number to be sure. This brings us to our story. Andover, Massachusetts lies inland of Salem and was set aside and incorporated as plantation land. When the witch hunts began, it was one of many area villages that found itself caught up in the hysteria. The mood of the town at the time was ripe for such an event. The Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter had just been revoked by the Crown, and the church was split by the differing ideologies of its 2 pastors. On top of this, the farmers lived in constant fear of the raids that were occurring in nearby villages. It's worth noting that an overwhelming majority, almost 80% of people accused and convicted of witchcraft were women. The Puritan belief was that women were inherently sinful and more susceptible to damnation than men were. Many Puritans held the belief that while men and women were equal in the eyes of God, they were not so in the eyes of the devil. Women's souls were seen as unprotected in their weak and vulnerable bodies. Historian Elizabeth Reese has asserted that some likely believed they had truly given in to the devil, even if only temporarily. In fact, one instance of this is Abigail Faulkner, who was accused in 1692. Faulkner said that she was, quote, angry at what folk said, unquote, and that the devil may have temporarily overtaken her. Let's be honest. Haven't we all at some point been so mad that we've done something or said something we've immediately regretted? The Puritan explanation was that in that moment of weakness, the devil took over. A both terrifying and convenient thought. Also, because those who confessed were often reintegrated into society, some women might have confessed to spare their own lives. Quarrels with neighbors were often the catalyst for witchcraft allegations, and women who did not conform to the norms of Puritan society were more likely to be the target of accusations, especially those who were unmarried or who did not have children. Such was the case with Martha Carrier, the first person in Andover to be accused of witchcraft. Martha was known as a strong-minded woman who would speak her mind, not a trait generally admired by many Puritans at the time. She was accused by her neighbor Benjamin Abbott after they had gotten into an argument that involved a land dispute. After the disagreement, Abbott fell sick and blamed his illness on her bewitching him and would later testify that she had killed one of his cows. Martha was quickly followed in her accusation by her sister, brother-in-law, and niece. Soon after, a young man named Timothy Swan had fallen ill and began making accusations against several residents. When the wife of Andover resident Joseph Ballard fell sick later that summer, they believed that her illness may have been caused by witchcraft, and Mr. Ballard soon requested the help of two of the afflicted girls from Salem Village, Ann Putnam Jr. and Mary Walcott, to identify who had caused his wife's illness. After visiting Elizabeth Ballard, the girls claimed that several people in Andover had bewitched her. With the help of the town's younger pastor, Reverend Thomas Barnard, who had once been the protege of Reverend Cotton Mather, the spark quickly turned to flame, with over 80% of the town's residents becoming involved in the hysteria. By the time the town's elders had realized that it had gotten out of control, it was almost too late. When they comprehended the full implications of the hysteria, they turned to the town's older minister, Reverend Francis Dane, who had opposed the trials from the very beginning, and formed a resistance movement. It was with his help that they were finally able to free the imprisoned members of their families. During the course of the legal proceedings, 45 people, more than any other village in the colonies, were formally accused of having made a covenant with the devil. The town also holds the records for most confessed witches and the highest number of children arrested. Prestigious awards indeed. Of those accused Andover residents, Martha Carrier, Mary Ayr Parker, and Samuel Wardwell were convicted and executed. 5 more either pled guilty at arraignment or were convicted at trial. These 5, Mary Lacey Sr., Abigail Faulkner Sr., Sarah Wardwell, Elizabeth Johnson Jr., and Ann Foster, were later granted reprieves by Governor William Phipps. Unfortunately, Ann Foster died in prison before she could be released. So how does all of this relate to what's seen in Little Hope? In the game, we see the touch test, which was exclusive to Andover, at least in the American colonies. The touch test worked on the idea that the victims of sorcery would have a special reaction to physical contact with their evildoer. In cases where a possessed person fell into spells or fits, the suspected witch would be brought into the room and asked to lay a hand on them. A non-reaction signaled innocence, but if the victim came out of their fit, it was seen as proof that the suspect had placed them under a spell. Of all the so-called tests to determine witchdom, witchiness, witchery, this is by far one of the least logical and most ridiculous, let alone the easiest for the accuser to fake. Even Salem's minister Samuel Parris was opposed. But wait, I hear you say, what if the victim were blindfolded? I'm glad you asked. You see, touch tests played a famous part in the 1662 trial of Rose Cullender and Amy Denny, 2 elderly Englishwomen charged with bewitching a pair of young girls. The children had been suffering from fits that left their fists clenched so tightly that even a strong man could not pry their fingers apart. But early tests showed that they easily opened whenever Cullender or Denny touched them. To ensure the reaction was genuine, judges had the children blindfolded and touched by other members of the court. The girls unclenched their fists anyway, which suggested that they were faking. But even this was not enough to prove the women's innocence. Cullender and Denny were both later hanged as witches. In Andover, 18 of the accused persons were gathered to perform this test, and despite the use of blindfolds, all 18 were arrested based on this. So it seems like the purpose of this pointless ordeal was just to make people feel better about killing someone. In the game, we also see that one of the accused is burned at the stake. But while witch burning was a favorite pastime in Europe, no witches were actually burned alive this side of the pond. Burning was viewed as the most horribly painful way to execute someone, and I'm not inclined to disagree. According to Holy Roman law codes, those who made a covenant with the devil deserved only the worst way to go. In Salem, however, hanging was the preferred way to dispose of your witches. What about being crushed by rocks? Well, this wasn't something that was used as a means of execution per se. In point of fact, this horrific torture was used to elicit a plea from the accused. The legal name for this, and forgive my horrible French, was peine forte de Dieu. You see, if a defendant in a capital offense made a plea, either guilty or not guilty, and then was later found guilty and executed, his heirs would inherit nothing, his lands and property as cheating to the crown. So by not making a plea, or by standing mute, the defendant retained his property for his heirs. He also guaranteed himself a horrible, horrible death. There has only been one instance of this sanctioned in American history, and it was during the Salem Witch Trials. Giles Corey, an English-born American farmer, was accused of witchcraft along with his wife Martha. He refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty and was subjected to pressing in an effort to force him to plead. At the end of each day, they asked him to make a plea until after 3 days he succumbed to crushing suffocation. His last words? More weight. An act so badass that people still talk about it 400 years later. In Little Hope, we also see a character executed by drowning. Again, hanging was really the only way that witches were killed in Salem, but the infamous swimming test caused more than its fair share of drownings throughout the centuries. In this test, accused witches were dragged to the nearest body of water, stripped to their undergarments, bound, and then tossed in to see if they would sink or float. Since witches were believed to have spurned the sacrament of baptism, it was thought that the water would reject their body and prevent them from submerging. An innocent person, then, would sink like a stone, but a witch would simply bob on the surface. This, of course, makes total logical sense, and no one can convince me otherwise. The victim typically had a rope tied around their waist so that they could be pulled from the water if they sank. But it wasn't unusual for accidental drowning deaths to occur. You know what they say about eggs and omelets, right? Anybody? No? Okay, moving on. To the best of my knowledge, no witches were ever thrown off towers. I think the writers and developers threw this gruesome death in for a little variety, and so we could have this creepy fucker. In the end, the history of witch trials is a long and brutal one, and a time that makes you want to pretend that it was much longer ago than it actually was. In fact, it has been reported that more than 3,000 people were killed by lynch mobs in Tanzania between 2005 and 2011 for allegedly being witches. And this, of course, is before we get into the metaphorical witch hunts. At any rate, I can't say enough good things about Little Hope, the game anyway. And if you're interested in the witch trials, I'd highly recommend the Arthur Miller play The Crucible, which you probably had to read in middle school. In a pinch, the 1996 movie will do. Also, the 2015 horror film The Witch. Conversely, if you just want to be scarred for life, you can watch the nightmare disguised as a kids movie, The Witches. That's all for now, kids. See you next time.